Now, it will come as no surprise to anyone that I want to spend most of my time tonight talking about Iran. But I think it's also fitting that I should begin by speaking about Nelson Mandela and the meaning of his legacy for us as Americans, for us as Jews. In the 1980s, there was a sharp debate in this country about how the United States ought best to deal with the apartheid regime in South Africa. And on one side, there were those who argued, and this was the Reagan administration, that the best way of dealing with the apartheid regime was through a process of engagement, critical engagement, but engagement. And the argument that the administration made was that sanctions would only hurt ordinary people, above all, ordinary black people in South Africa. And furthermore, that South Africa, for all of its obvious moral failings, was nonetheless a critical strategic partner for the United States, and so that there were interests beyond morality, that there were interests of realpolitik in maintaining an alliance of sorts with that regime. Now, on the other side of the argument, there was a bipartisan coalition that ranged from Bob Dole to Lowell Weicker to Ted Kennedy, who thought that the best approach to the apartheid regime was also the most moral one. That is, a punitive regime of economic and diplomatic sanctions that would show South Africa's white rulers that they would not be allowed to profit from their rule, and that the only road to redemption was to eliminate their oppressive system and let the people, all of the people, rule. Now, as a columnist for the Wall Street Journal, I'd say I'm second to none in my admiration for Ronald Reagan. But I don't think there's any doubt as to who had the better side of that particular argument. In 1986, Congress passed sweeping sanctions legislation against South Africa, and Reagan vetoed the legislation. And then something remarkable happened. Congress overrode the veto. It was the first time in Congress's history that it had overridden a presidential veto on a foreign policy issue. A few days ago, reading obituaries for Mandela, I came across something that was said by a fellow by the name of Brian Dole, who was a Democrat and was a top aide to Ted Kennedy and helped draft the legislation on South African sanctions. This is what he said. He said, "Forget the morality and look at just the national interest, the self-interest. Standing with the bad guys not only looks bad, it is bad. And eventually they fall, and eventually there is dreadful resentment." Well, Brian Dole, former aide to Ted Kennedy, wherever you are, you were right. Sanctions brought an end to the apartheid regime in South Africa. Sanctions opened the gates at Robben Island. Sanctions forced the apartheid regime to eliminate the legal architecture of racial discrimination. And by the way, sanctions also persuaded the South African regime to dismantle their nuclear program, including the atomic bombs they had already built. Now, do any of you see where I'm going with this? We should think about this. We should think right now, we should have a national debate about whether the best way to get the Islamic Republic of Iran to change its behavior is either by reprising the Reagan strategy of engagement based on a form of realpolitik, or the bipartisan strategy of intensifying sanctions until the regime begins to understand that there is no wiggle room, that they will not be allowed to sweet talk their way into keeping their nuclear capabilities intact while having the economic pressure lifted, that the world will hold them accountable for the way the regime treats Iranian women and Iranian political dissenters and Iranian gay people and Iranian religious minorities. And we will not blindly ignore the comments by the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei, who the other day, at the height of the negotiations in Geneva, blurted out that Israel is, in his words, a, quote, rabid dog. And we also, all of us in the West, all of us in the United States, will not simply forget the memory of Neda Agha Sultan and the hundreds of young Iranians who died alongside her, fighting for democracy, and we will be faithful to her memory and not forsake it for the sake of just getting any face-saving deal with Iran. And by the way, we should remember that when we see Iran's suave foreign minister shaking hands with our Secretary of State in Geneva, or its pleasant-seeming president, Hassan Rouhani, giving speeches and smiling at the UN, we should not forget that when Neda was left to die in the streets of Tehran, those guys stood on the side of the regime that killed her. If we in the United States could muster the moral clarity to stand on the right side of history when it came to ending the apartheid regime in South Africa, despite all the arguments put forward for engaging it, can't we stand on the right side of history right now to show Iran that the consequences for violating multiple UN resolutions and threatening Israel with annihilation and repeatedly lying to the International Atomic Energy Agency about its nuclear programs and supporting Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza and Assad in Syria and the Taliban in Afghanistan will not be, the result of those actions will not be the lifting of economic sanctions and the preservation and assurances about their nuclear program. Now, some of you in this room who read the Wall Street Journal, and I will be selling subscriptions right outside later this evening, some of you who read the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal know how I feel about the interim nuclear deal that was struck last month in Geneva. In a column the other week, I called it worse than Munich. That's because I was being kind. Give Neville Chamberlain the benefit of the doubt. Understand the position he was in. When he struck that deal in September 1938 to allow Hitler to seize the Sudetenland, the Royal Air Force did not have a single squadron of Spitfire fighters, the fighters that went on to win the Battle of Britain in 1940. Britain had so thoroughly disarmed itself after the First World War that declaring war on Germany might have amounted to an act of national suicide on Britain's part. And at the same time, Winston Churchill was just a lone voice in the wilderness, warning against Hitler and the consequences of appeasement. By contrast, today, the administration has effectively taken the military option off the table, and yet we're the ones who are coming to negotiations with Iran. We're the ones who are acting in our negotiations with Iran as if we are the weak party, as if we are the supplicants. And today there is broad and bipartisan support for tightening sanctions on Iran, not loosening them. Mark my words, all Americans will come to rue the day when we try to solve the Iranian nuclear crisis by allowing Iran to get within weeks of being able to build a nuclear bomb. Just this weekend, it was reported that Iran is continuing to design and manufacture advanced centrifuges that will allow them to enrich uranium at 3 to 5 times their current rates of enrichment. Is this supposed to be the goodwill gesture that is going to build confidence toward a final agreement? Or is it the case that the Iranians are pressing their advantage against an administration whose red lines on Iran's nuclearization seem to be as permeable as the red lines on the use of chemical weapons by the Assad regime? There is one skill that every dictatorial regime, every tyrant needs in order to survive in power as long as the Islamic Republic and the Ayatollah Khamenei have survived. And that's the ability to sense the weakness of others and to take advantage of it. And that is exactly how Iran is behaving towards us today. So now we have this interim nuclear agreement, and the pressure is going to be powerful, almost overwhelming, to make a go of any final agreement. I don't think there is much that I can do that will change the administration's views. But let's at least be smart about what we in this room can do. For starters, we can support Mark Kirk and Senator Menendez in pushing to increase sanctions now, immediately, to send a signal to the Iranian regime that we are not simply folding. But I want to bring another idea to this room and tell me what you make of it. In September, the president decided that the issue of military strikes on Syria required congressional approval. Now, I'm not sure that was really true, but let's concede that point for now. If the president thought Congress's approval was necessary back then, shouldn't Congress also demand that any deal the administration reach with Iran require the approval of the Senate, just as all international treaties constitutionally require the agreement of 2/3 of the United States Senate? Now is the time to tell Senator Boxer and Feinstein in California and Senators Schumer and Gillibrand in New York that they should demand an up or down vote on any agreement the administration reaches with Iran. We know these senators are pro-Israel and pro-Iran sanctions when they are giving speeches at AIPAC's policy conference before audiences like this one. Well, let's make them go on the record. Are they prepared? Are they seriously prepared to stand up against a bad nuclear deal with Iran, to stand with us, even if it means crossing the administration? Let's see if all of those friendly speeches are anything more than simple donor maintenance. So let's see how this plays out, because part of the problem that Israel faces in the world today isn't just that it is surrounded by enemies who are sworn to its destruction. A large part of the problem, perhaps the equal part of the problem, is that Israel suffers from a surfeit of phony friends whose idea of friendship is to profess that friendship right up until the point when it actually counts and the chips are down. Now, I don't mean to say by this that a true friend of Israel can't also be a sympathetic and loving critic of Israel. And one of the ugliest and dumbest accusations lodged against organizations like Stand With Us or against columnists like me is that our notion of being a friend of Israel is demanding 100% agreement with everything Israel does or stands for or asks for. But how about, at a minimum, 60% agreement? How about even 51% agreement? How about agreement on some of the basics, like treating Hamas as the terrorist organization that it is, or showing some understanding of why Israel might be just a tiny bit frustrated with the way Mahmoud Abbas has approached peace negotiations? How about 51% agreement that maybe the Palestinians should make some real concessions of their own for the independent state they claim to seek, like conceding the point that Israel is and will forever remain a Jewish state? How about not simply demanding that Israelis or Jews apologize for any Israeli mistake, real or imagined, and start demanding that the Palestinians apologize for some of their mistakes and outrages, beginning with Ma'alot? And how about agreeing that the U.S. should not be advocating a nuclear deal with Iran that does not insist and demand and require that the regime absolutely abandon its enrichment capability and absolutely abandon its plutonium breeding facility, and does not insist on supporting terrorist organizations around the world, and insists that it stops calling for Israel's destruction? Can we at least agree in this room on that? Because if we can agree on that, if you can't agree on that, I don't think you're really a friend of Israel. Yes, let's welcome as many people as we can into the circle, the big tent of Israel's friends. But let's not pretend that you can honestly call yourself a friend to Israel just because you don't actually profess or advocate its destruction or accuse it of being a criminal state. Friendship is not free. But friendship, as the saying goes, also has its benefits. We live in a world where the question of where you stand on Israel is the defining moral question of our day, just as the question of where you stood on apartheid was the defining moral question of its own day. To stand with Israel is to stand for the right of small countries to live in freedom and peace against their much larger and more aggressive enemies. To stand with Israel is to take a stand for liberal democracy under siege from fanatical religious dictators. To stand with Israel is to stand for the values of a humane civilization defined by freedom and tolerance and pluralism and equality of the sexes and the freedom of intellectual inquiry and of science against the threat of 21st century barbarism. To stand with Israel is also to stand for American interests, above all, our interest in preventing terror-sponsoring regimes from gaining weapons of mass destruction. Above all, to stand with Israel is to stand for the idea of truth, the inviolability of truth, in the face of the blizzard of lies that are told about it. All civilization ultimately rests on the belief that the truth remains what it is, however unpopular or inconvenient or unfashionable it may be at any given time. And if anyone in this audience, and I gather many people in this audience, come from college campuses, you know personally just how unpopular and inconvenient and uncomfortable and unfashionable it can sometimes be to stand with Israel. Well, don't let that get you down. The margin between reason and unreason, between the rule of law and the whims of the mob, between civilization and barbarism, has always been maintained by the person, the country, and the statesman who is prepared to be unpopular and annoying and unfashionable for the sake of standing up for the truth. Today, in this room, that person is you. Today, in this world, that country is Israel. And let's hope and let's seek for the statesmen in this country who are your equals and who are Israel's equals. I have to say something frankly. I have never been more afraid in my life for Israel's future than I am today. I arrived in Israel as the editor of the Jerusalem Post at the height of the Second Intifada, when there were suicide bombings in my neighborhood, down the street from me, nearly every single day for going on 3 years. At the time, I wasn't afraid for the country because I began to understand just how strong and resolute and resourceful it was. I was in Israel in 2006 for the war against Hezbollah, when after a general call-up of reserves, more than 100% of those called up answered the call. People beyond the age of service answered the call to stand up and fight for their country. And I wasn't afraid for Israel then. And I was in Israel for the war with Hamas in 2009. And once again, I didn't fear for the future of the country. That's not the case today. America is not a declining country, but we are in a declinist mood, and we are in strategic retreat across the globe, above all in the Middle East. And this is exposing vulnerable allies, and it is giving opportunities to adventurous enemies in ways the world has not seen since the 1930s. And the challenge of Iran is scary no matter how you look at it, but it's scariest most of all from the position of Israel, that finds itself isolated diplomatically and may soon find itself isolated militarily. I do not envy Benjamin Netanyahu this job. But since I began by talking about Mandela, let me also approach my conclusion by quoting him. Mandela once was asked about the meaning of courage. He said that what defined the courageous man wasn't the absence of fear. Fear is a reality whether you are courageous or not. What makes a person courageous is his ability to overcome his fears. And that's an example worth following, a legacy worth sharing, whether you're in Johannesburg or Jerusalem or Los Angeles. Let me say one final thing, which I think is important. Earlier in this evening, one of the speakers talked about all the great things that Israel does in science and technology and the arts, the rule of law, what it does for the environment. It's a very, very long and extraordinary list for a country of barely 7 million people, not quite the size of New York City. All of us are proud of Israel because it's good. But the reason we support Israel is not because it's good. Israel is good and will always be good. But that's not why we support Israel. And I think this is the last word I want to leave you with tonight. You don't support a country based on its performance, because sometimes that performance will fail. Israel is a country that consists of human beings. The reason we support Israel is because it is ours. And the state of Israel did not come into existence to showcase Jewish vulnerability and Jewish victimhood. The state of Israel and this is the last thing I'm going to say to you tonight, the state of Israel exists to end Jewish vulnerability and Jewish victimhood. Thank you very much.